Hello and welcome to this video on practical strategies for literature reviews. My name's Nicole Pepperell and this is a recording from the GUS Research Training Unit. This video is designed particularly for students who are doing research theses, but the information it contains is also potentially useful for students who are working on a capstone or a minor thesis, anyone who might need to do a large-scale and fairly comprehensive literature reviewing process. So the first thing I want to talk about is identifying and prioritizing the kind of work that you need to do. When people think about literature reviews and how to do them, they start thinking about search strategies. And that's important and it's something you'll want to think about, but it's actually not something I'm going to talk about a lot in this video. What I want to talk about instead is thinking about what kind of background work you need to do to make your literature work easier. So for some of you, that may mean that you need to develop particular kinds of language or technical skills to read the literature that is your target literature. There are many disciplines that require some kind of advanced mathematical skills. You need to know how to read mathematical notation. You need to be able to work through mathematical processes. So you may need background in that. You may need to become more fluent with that to be efficient in reading your literature. Some of you may have literatures that span multiple languages, and so you'll need to brush up or hone your language skills so that you can read more quickly when you're reading across different languages. Some of you may need general background in a discipline or a field in order to be able to understand what's going on in the literature. This is not something that you actually include in your literature review. Generally speaking, the literature you read presupposes that readers have this kind of general background. But if you are changing fields or specializations, or if you've had a long gap between periods of study, or it happens often in professional practice that you will not do literature reviews frequently enough to be fully up on the state of whatever discipline you're doing them in. So you may need some general background work very quickly and very efficiently in order to make it possible for you to understand what's going on in your target literature. Unless you have been doing a lot of work specifically with the literature that you need to review, you probably need to do some quick overview work to help you very efficiently identify the most important and influential works in a body of literature and get a sense of the shape of the literature. We've talked in other videos about the fact that a literature review is an organized and structured way of presenting the literature by grouping it into categories. It can be a lot easier to group the literature into categories if first you've looked at how other people are grouping it. In some fields there is a very customary consensus way of describing the literature, and if that's the case you're going to want to know that. In other fields everybody sort of organizes the literature in slightly different ways, and that's useful to know too because it lets you know that you have some latitude when you're organizing the literature yourself. This kind of quick introductory overview reading, while it will usually make your life easier, is almost never sufficient for the literature review, but it's often a good starting point. Do you need to do a systematic literature review on a question or a method or a specific topic? There are disciplines that have a very, very strong expectation that you will do a systematic literature review and that you will describe the strategy and techniques used for that review right at the top, sort of like a method for a literature review, and it is intended that other people be able to replicate that method. If you are doing a research thesis, there is certainly an expectation that you do a very comprehensive literature review process, whether that takes the form of spelling out your literature review technique or whether it just takes the form of you developing that technique yourself and then showing the results of it in your comprehensive sweep of the literature. And then for many people, if your project is at all large scale, you will do your literature work, and then a lot of time will pass between the literature work and when your research is finished and you need to actually be distributing it or publishing it in some form. And in that time, new literature will have become available. So how do you stay current after your initial literature review to make sure that your final literature is comprehensively addressed? So we'll talk about those in this video. So in terms of language and technical skills, your goal here is to read more efficiently. It will really slow you down if you're trying to read literature and it's written in other languages and you don't have a very firm grasp of the languages that you're going to need to read, or if you need some sort of advanced mathematics skills, or if you're in a literature that uses various kinds of formalizations and that have notation systems that you need to learn, you'll want to master these relatively early, and it may mean slowing down at the beginning in order to really focus on the development of these skills so that you can speed up later on. It is better to slow down at the beginning and really master what you need to know than sort of move at not quite optimal pace the whole way through. If you're wanting to read in other languages, there are a number of free and quite good tools at this point for learning at least the most common languages. You can use free services like Memrise and Duolingo to work on vocabulary and grammar. There's a large number of fairly inexpensive commercial services that you can use to learn languages. There are also formal traditional language classes. Some are offered at RMIT University, and if you are a student here, you may be able to take advantage of those, but there are language classes available from a large number of providers. If you basically know your target languages, but you're still struggling with specialist vocabulary, Google Translate has a browser plugin that's quite handy that will translate everything from whole pages to snippets and phrases. There's a tool called Readlang, and I think there's some other commercial services like it at this point, where you can use that tool as you're reading, and it will not only let you highlight words or phrases to translate those on the fly while the rest of the text remains in the target language, but Readlang will also keep track in the background of the words that you're highlighting and what you're asking to be defined, and it'll create a set of flashcards for you which you can use to drill vocabulary. Again, I'm not trying to specifically plug Readlang, it just happens to be one I'm familiar with, but I think there are a number of other services that do things like this. So if you're working regularly in multiple languages, you may want a tool that plugs in that can help you really easily shift back and forth and get quick translations and maybe drill yourself on some vocabulary that you're still needing to learn. For mathematics learning, there are a variety of different resources. Obviously, there's a pile of sort of textbooks that you can check out and work through, but there's also a lot of online material, and it's gotten to a quite high standard at this point. Khan Academy is one of the most well-known ones. It goes all the way from elementary arithmetic up to quite advanced mathematics. It has a set of videos that teach you how to do various things, and then a set of interactive exercises. It is better for some fields of mathematics than others, but it's worth having a browse. They regularly revise their content, and it is quite comprehensive. You can also take advantage of the fact that many universities have what's sometimes called open courseware, which is they record all of their lectures and sometimes they put other materials online free for anyone who would like to watch, and you can get really systematic, high-level instruction in, among other things, mathematics through open courseware. So you might search on that. RMIT offers a quantitative techniques course that you should take if you're thinking that you're going to need to do quantitative data analysis. And there's also a quantitative consulting service that, once you've done your basic training, can help you tweak what you know so that it's specific to your own project. There are YouTube and online tutorials that are fantastic for specific software packages. So once you've decided on a statistics package that you want to use, you can often get training directly from the maker of that package and from a whole variety of other people just by going on YouTube. And of course, there are traditional textbooks and reference texts. The point is that you're going to want to tackle this early. You don't want to wait to the point that you're struggling with your reading or you're trying to do your data analysis and you're lacking the technical skills to move forward. So general background reading, some of you won't need this. Some of you will be doing an advanced research thesis and it will be precisely in the field in which you've trained and you've done your earlier degrees recently, and so you don't really need to brush up on your skills. But for those of you who have had a gap in your learning, you've maybe spent some time in industry and you're coming back to do a research degree, or if you're making a career change and your research degree is in a different area from where you did your earlier training, you're probably going to want to brush up in some way. Some of the more efficient ways to do this are to quickly look online, searching for syllabi or reading lists from other university programs that are in your discipline. They might be from RMIT, they might be from overseas, but if you use an appropriate disciplinary search term and tag the word syllabi or course guide or something like that onto it, you will often pull up lots and lots and lots of material. And then what you want to do is skim across several different syllabi or course guides, and you want to find out, well, what are the works that everybody's teaching? Probably those are things that anyone in my disciplinary space is expected to have read. I'd better read those to be up to date. They're probably going to be referred to or presupposed in a lot of the literature that you find in your literature review. OpenCourseWare is again useful for this. You can find overview or survey courses in most major disciplines online these days, and so you can set yourself up with some podcasts or some videos, and you can listen in on the same kinds of lectures that you would get if you were attending an undergraduate or master's program in a particular field. You can also find what are sometimes called handbooks or reference texts that are specifically designed to cover the major concepts and the intellectual history of a field, and grabbing a couple of those and quickly skimming through them to make sure that you're familiar with the sorts of topics that are being discussed. If you need this kind of background, again, the earlier and the quicker you obtain it, the easier you're going to find all the rest of your literature work, because literature work is written to other specialists. It is written with the presupposition that the other people reading are also scholars in the field, and it will normally not be trying to bring you along if you lack that kind of generalist background. So you're going to want to obtain that background early. Now, for most of you, quick introductions to your literature is going to be something that you're going to need. So not all of you will need general background, not all of you will need specialist technical skills. You might already have both of those, but most of you are not already incredibly well versed in your literature. And so my recommendation is, rather than diving straight into designing a search strategy and grabbing articles that come up in a search, that instead you take a few steps that are really quick, condensed ways of seeing how other people have organized your literature and tried to review it comprehensively. So the goal here is to find at least a half dozen, maybe a few more, comprehensive literature reviews, where you will read the reviews of your literature first, and then you will use those to help you leverage into your own reading list for the literature itself. So your goal here is to gain a quick schematic overview of the literature as a whole, so that when you start reading individual works, it is easier for you to slot those works in to the sort of overall organized framework of the literature as a whole entity. So you want to look for a quick state of play. What sorts of things, when people write about this literature, are they pointing out? How do they categorize it? What are the major debates? Who are the major players? And you're going to leverage other people's comprehensive literature reviews to get this knowledge. Sometimes other people are not right, or sometimes the way that they characterize the literature is not the most useful way to characterize it from the standpoint of your project. So while you want to read several of these, you don't want to feel like you need to mimic them. You don't want to feel like they are necessarily the same sorts of things you're going to write for your own work, but you just want to use them to get you where you're going faster, and then you'll need to do your own refined and individual version of them. So what you want to do first is find works that predictably concentrate discussion of the relevant literature. The easiest place to do this generally is to find several recent doctoral theses, generally doctoral theses written across several different countries, and generally you do want to find a number of these, not just one. The thing that you know about a recent doctoral thesis is that it was required to comprehensively review the literature. That is an expectation of any doctoral thesis. And if you're able to see the doctoral thesis, you know that it did at least a good enough job with the literature to pass. Okay, so that's an important standard. You want them to be recent, so that the literature searching reflected in the thesis is as recent as possible. A thesis from 20 years ago might be interesting in other ways, but it's not your best route into the literature. So doctoral theses within the last few years, published in a range of countries, so that you can look at several different examples of comprehensive doctoral level literature reviews and get a feel for what they have in common and where they differ. Once you've done that, you'll want to start searching for other kinds of concentrated looks at the literature. And there are a number of things that you can start searching for here. You might search for collections of scholarship on your question, so special issues of journals, book series that are dedicated to your topic or your field, handbooks or other collections of scholarly articles that are gathered together so that you get a lot of works on a related theme in one volume, proceedings that come out of themed conferences. Or you can try searching for someone else's systematic literature review on your question. You're more likely to find those in some fields than in others, and you find them by using search terms like systematic literature review or overview literature review or history of field, and then tacking onto that the specific search terms that would come up for your topic. Now, what you want to do with these works, you're not finding them to read them in themselves, not at this point. What you are interested in is specifically how do they survey the literature. So what you're using them for is to get a good concentrated source of reference lists and bibliographies, and also to get several different examples of how other people organize and categorize the literature. And again, some literatures there is a sort of a consensus way of describing what's going on, and if there is that consensus, you want to know what it is. Most literatures, people have quite a lot of choice about how they slice and dice the literature, depending on the kind of argument they're trying to make, and you want to see some examples of that to get a feel for successful ways of organizing the literature. You probably want to retain this habit when you start reading individual works, but right now your goal is not really to sleep with what you find under your pillow and to read it in detail. Your goal is to mine it for what it can tell you about possible things to read and ways of categorizing your literature. And from these very concentrated sources that give you lots of different citations in a very short space of time, you want to use a technique that I call snowballing. So you want to use the citations you've got to find other citations in a big sweep so that by the end of it you've got a reasonably hefty list that you can categorize in specific ways of things that you want to read. So when you mine the literature, so you've found, let's say, half a dozen or maybe a dozen concentrated sources that talk about the literature, you want to take a look at works that are cited many times. So if a work is cited across every single concentrated literature review you find, there's a really good chance that's an important and influential work. Even if a work is cited in half of the literature reviews you find, there's a pretty good chance that it's important and influential. And if that's the case, you want a list, a category for important and influential works, because probably you need to know those works to be a competent writer in your field. If a work is important and influential, it is itself usually a good thing to know in order to leverage it to find other works. So if you go to a tool like Google Scholar, Google Scholar has a cited by function, and there's another video that is up on Blackboard specifically on how to use the cited by function. But basically you can put a work into a Google Scholar search, that work will come up, and then there's a little link underneath it that tells you all the other people that have cited that thing. The more important and influential a work, the more other people have cited it, and therefore the more other literature you can find using the cited by function. So important and influential works you're going to want to identify because you need to know them, but also because they are particularly saturated ways of spiraling out and finding additional literature. You want to quickly backtrack the literature references that you find, and you want to focus initially on, as you're reading through the literature reviews that you find in your first sweep, you want to look at what they're citing and you want to say, how relevant is this individual work that they've cited from my research? There's some techniques for thinking about this in the Week 5 study guide. But you'll basically want to take a look at the abstract, take a look at the sections, and get a general feel for how closely related that particular piece of literature is to what you need to be talking about and what you need to know for your own study. If the work is relevant, you want to backtrack to that work and you want to take a look at its references and how it categorizes the literature, because by reading relevant works, they probably have similar literature needs to yours, and you may be able to get a whole new collection of good literature to read by backtracking to the works that seem particularly relevant to you. You will want to keep multiple lists, whether you're using a tool like EndNote or Zotero or Mendeley or some other kind of citation management system, or whether you've just got a good old-fashioned set of Word documents. It doesn't matter at this point, but you want to be categorizing your literature from very early on. You, at the very minimum, want to pick out important and influential works that any educated scholar in your area needs to read, and you want to prioritize as well works that seem particularly important for some aspect of your own work, and there are probably lots of other useful categories. Start dividing the literature into categories at this point before you've even done much reading, because it will help you prioritize your reading. And a lot of people find it easier to read a collection of closely related works so that they can help make sense of the argument. So start categorizing the literature. Some of your categories may be wrong. You may move a work into a different category later on. That's not so important. The important thing is to not end up with one undifferentiated list with 300 works on it. That's very intimidating, it's very difficult to work through, and it's not particularly useful. So try to chunk things up and develop separate lists for reading in particular areas. And then you can use database tools or Google Scholar tools to help you find new works that cite the works that are most interesting for you. It's a good way of working forward in time as you work through the literature, and particularly when you find there'll always be some collection of works where you feel really on the same wavelength as the person who's written those works. And the citations from those people are often really, really valuable. Okay, you find the people who think like you, who seem to have a similar creative or scholarly spark, and they are likely to know a literature that will be of particular interest to you. So you spend a period of time snowballing, backtracking from someone's reference list to other works, and then looking at the reference lists of those other works and backtracking those. And at some point, you're going to end up with a list that is really too long, okay? And that happens to everyone. Don't be afraid to draw a line. What you're trying to do at this stage is just get a general feel. What are the major debates? Who are the major people? What does the literature roughly look like in my area? And at some point, you're going to have to say, okay, that's cool, I've got a good general overview, but I need to read some things now. I need to dig in and start going into detail, and so you draw a line. That line will not be your final line. So periodically, as you move through your research process, you will expand out again, you will go back into citations in your articles, you will do new searches, and you'll add new literature, and you'll go through this process again. So a process of expansion and then consolidation and then re-expansion and reconsolidation is normal in doing any kind of comprehensive literature review. So for what's called a systematic literature review is a phrase used if your goal is to create a replicable search strategy. So replicable means somebody else can read what you've done, and based on what they've read, they can go and do it themselves. Okay, so they can see if they get the same results, if they do the same actions that you've reported doing. And it is generally designed to comprehensively identify all of the relevant literature on a particular problem. These are particularly common in medical fields because sometimes there's not been a single study done on something, but lots of little case reports or lots of small-scale studies, none of which are particularly well-powered themselves, but if you gather them all together, maybe you can learn something. Or people are starting to get worried that maybe there's a lot of unpublished work that says something different from the published literature, and so you might do a very comprehensive and systematic search of all kinds of literature to try to figure out questions like this. But even though it is particularly common in medical disciplines, it is not unheard of in social science, and the implicit expectation, particularly for doctoral work, is in fact that you will have done a quite comprehensive search of the literature. So thinking about what you're doing in terms of a systematic literature review can be a good way of understanding what the expectations are. So some disciplines are going to expect that at the top of your literature review, you're going to state what your search strategy was, and that way everybody can see it and they can criticize it or they can approve of it and they can replicate it if they want to. Whether you have to write it at the top of your literature review or not is something that you can work out by talking to your supervisors, by reading other doctoral theses in your field, and generally by taking a look at your literature, maybe attending some milestone sessions for other people at similar points in their candidature and seeing what they're doing. But whether you have to write it down as part of your thesis or not, I would argue that you should have an explicit search strategy for your own purposes. It will help you focus and be confident about what you need to do. There's a commonly reported sort of nightmare at some point in someone's candidature where they wake up in a cold sweat, terrified that they've missed a study and that study is identical to theirs and their work is not original, and if only they'd known they could have done something about it. Rather than having that nightmare, it's better to have an explicit, comprehensive search strategy that you can discuss with your supervisors and you can get feedback on, so that you can reassure yourself that you have found all the literature that you need to find. So what does a search strategy have in it? Well, it has the search terms that you used, and there are other videos talking about how to develop good search terms, so I won't repeat that here. But generally, you're trying to make sure that you've thought of all the likely synonyms and related terms, and that you've picked the right level of abstraction to cast a wide enough net for the literature you need to find. And again, you can workshop search terms with your supervisors if you're not really sure what to use. You want to list the databases that you searched. Different databases will have access to different literature, and so it can make a real difference what you find depending on where you look for it. Probably don't pick only one database. You probably want to search across a range of databases that are known to have a good cross-section of literature for your particular discipline. And again, your supervisors can probably advise what is regarded as best practice given the discipline you're writing in. You want to decide whether your search is going to include what's called gray literature. So gray literature is anything that is not commercially published. So it might include a doctoral thesis, a report, a white paper, a newsletter, a technical note, anything that might be possibly relevant to your topic, but it has not gone through a full commercial publication process. And so there's a sense in which it hasn't been vetted to the same degree. Some literature searches deliberately leave gray literature out, and for some searchers, gray literature is particularly important, and whether you include or don't include it is often something that you need to provide a rationale for. You need to talk about whether you've made any attempt to identify unpublished literature. Again, this can become particularly important for medical research or for any research where you're worried that there is a strong hypothesis, that people think the hypothesis is true because of prior published research, but there's something called the file drawer problem, where people tend to publish positive results. Journals are more likely to take positive results, and negative results end up in someone's file drawer and they never end up published. And this skews our sense of what is true, of what research has shown. So for certain kinds of research, it can be particularly relevant to make an effort to find unpublished research. And you might do that by looking at research that's been funded, but where there don't seem to be any published outputs, or looking at conference talks where there don't seem to be any published outputs. There are various ways to find unpublished literature. And your search strategy needs to discuss the limitations of what you're doing. If you can only read English and you're only searching in English, that's a severe limitation. So you want to make a note that you're looking at the English language scholarship on a subject. If you've restricted by date, if you didn't access anything prior to 1995, that might be relevant. The search parameters are used and things like that. So a systematic literature review requires an explicit search strategy, and whether you need to write that into your thesis or not, I think you will benefit yourself from having a written explicit search strategy for what you're going to use that you can then run around and get feedback on from other people. So the last thing is, if you have a project of any decent size, you're going to be working on it for some years, you're going to do a literature reviewing process relatively early, because you do your literature review process to make sure your project is original, and so you need to do the literature review for the most part before you're too deep into the trenches of the project itself. But as you move forward, that literature review is going to date in various ways. Research is going to continue to be published. Works that were not previously indexed and therefore didn't turn up in your original search are going to be indexed, so even if they are old works, you might only recently become able to see them. New databases may become available, or there may be improvements to existing databases, and so stuff becomes visible that wasn't visible when you did your original search. So you need a strategy for staying current and learning about newly available publications. Major databases have notification and alert systems, so once you've worked out effective search terms, you can set up appropriate notifications. And I've linked to some short videos produced by other people on the Blackboard that will talk about setting up alerts for different databases. You can keep track of relevant conferences and skim the abstracts there. It can give you a feel for work that isn't published but is forthcoming. You can contact authors and ask them for advance copies or drafts. Some people will give these to you and some will not. You can have a chat even if you're not gonna get a draft. Being able to attend conferences is often a good way, just by talking to people, to get a feel for work that's coming out and participate in some live discussions of things that are not yet published. And obviously you want to keep track and keep up with the most recent issues from important journals in your field. So those are the various dimensions of trying to efficiently keep on top of your literature. More specific skills like how do you do a good search, I've got covered in other videos produced elsewhere, and I don't think I'll record unique content on that. But obviously you should also be talking to your supervisor if you're struggling with search terms and things like that.